Excellent. Hello to everybody coming in. I'm going to give you all kind of a few minutes to trickle on in since it is exactly 7 o'clock, and give everybody a moment. But for those of you who are coming in, hello. My name is Nicole. I'm the manager of Oblong Books in Rhinebeck, and we are so excited to have you here for tonight's event. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before I hand it over to our two wonderful authors tonight. The first is, thank you for attending our event. You all attending events like this is how we are able to do our business and able to continue to put on events like this. One of the best things you can do if you are at this event is buy books, buy their books. Books make great gifts. So if you already have their books, buy another book. It all helps us to be able to support our local community and wonderful authors like these. The other little piece of housekeeping is just a reminder that this is not the only event we do. We do a bunch of in-person and online events. Our next Oblong online event will be Thursday, October 6th with Sari Botten for her memoir, if you are interested. So you can sign up for that at oblongbooks.com. And I think that is all of the housekeeping. So I'm going to introduce our two wonderful authors for today. So where's my sheet? There it is. So today's book is Three Muses. It is Martha's incredible debut novel, if I'm remembering correctly. It is about a Holocaust survival venturing through memory, trauma, identity, and ballet. I have a soft spot for novels with ballerinas, so I'm very excited about this. For those of you who might not know Martha already, she is a novelist, a book reviewer, an essayist, a social justice advocate with reviews, essays, and short fiction appearing in, I don't know, small places like NPR Books and the Washington Post, places you've definitely never heard about before. She is in conversation. Oh, Martha is also the founding executive director of the Butler Family Fund, which I just think is super cool. And she is in conversation today with Sharon, who is the award-winning author of 7 published poetry collections and a memoir about her work with incarcerated girls called I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent, which is one of my favorite memoirs actually to hand sell in the store. We've sold a bunch of them, and I'm very excited to sell a bunch of Three Muses. So I'm going to hand it over to these two wonderful authors who are going to sit in conversation for a while. We're going to keep the chat closed today just to keep things a little streamlined. But if you have any questions for our authors, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to drop any questions you might have in that Q&A box, and I'll come in with about 10 minutes left in our event and pepper them with all of your glorious questions. So without further ado, everybody please give a round of applause in your homes to the wonderful Martha and Sharon.
This is such a treat. I met Martha 5 years ago, I think, at a writing residency called Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. And that was when she was really, she was really on her journey to get this book published. And it was a pretty frustrating journey at that point. And maybe she can tell you more about that. But here it is, it's published. So that's, all of us who have published books know that the journey is often very frustrating, but the fruits are pretty great. And this woman persists. So as I said, she'll tell us more about that. Maybe there's lots of questions. I mean, I think more questions than we have time for, but that I have anyway. Martha works incredibly hard at everything she does. Her interviewing, her social justice work, her writing, of course, and especially her friendships. She's a loyal, generous, wonderful, caring friend, and I am so lucky to have her in my life and to be able to share her and her brilliant debut novel with you. Here's to you, Martha. I know you've had a week of wonderful star-studded interviews, and I'm happy that you're doing this one at my home bookstore. So
Thank you. I just want to say a huge thank you to Oblong Books, to Helen Seslowski, who set this up, and to Nicole, and especially to Sharon. And if you haven't read Sharon's poetry, please buy a lot of her books. It's exquisite. And also her memoir. And I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So I think you've answered this question quite a lot this week, but I'd like to hear, our people here need to understand who the three muses are and where they come from and what they mean in the book. So Martha, can you
Sure.
tell us about that?
So I've quoted Anne Enright a lot this week. She's an Irish novelist who's won the Booker Prize, and I heard her speak in Washington a few years ago, and she said, if you meet a debut novelist, they're usually on their 16th novel, which is about what it was for me, a lot of unpublished novels. But in 2010, I was looking around to start a new novel, and I was looking for a framework, really, and I stumbled on this myth from the region of Boeotia in Greece, which has only 3 muses. You know, when we were in elementary school, we learned about 9 Greek muses. There are only 3 in this tradition. The first is song, the second is discipline, and discipline includes the concept of prayer and preparation for prayer. So it has a spiritual component as well. And then memory. And I thought this would make an amazing framework for a story that I had been thinking about, which involves a Holocaust survivor named, as a child, he was named Yanko. When he grew up, he was called John, whose mother saves him in the line for the gas chamber by telling the SS officer that he can sing. So he survives the war by singing for the commandant who murdered his family. He makes his way to New York and becomes a psychiatrist. He is loosely associated with song, and song is what saved him, but it's also what traumatizes him. And he falls in love with a ballerina who must have music to work. So there's something of a conflict there. So in order for him to see her work and appreciate her art, he has to listen to music. Her name was Catherine Silman. She grew up in Queens, and her choreographer, who is named Boris Yankov, has groomed her essentially to be his lover, his paramour, his co-creator. And he gives her the name of Katya Simonova when she's a teenager, hoping that she will grow into this great prima ballerina with a Russian name. And she is loosely associated with discipline because that's what she needs to develop her art.
Great. I know finding a structure is always a huge, important, well, very critical part of writing any book, a memoir or novel, even poetry. So this gave you a great way to hang your characters and story. Let's start with Katya. I wrote a quote from, would he ever see her as separate from him? Me too. As I told you, the relationship between Katya and Boris Yanko made me crazy, but that is the power of your writing. I know it was the 50s and a different time. I mean, I know that time very well. And that early trauma made her more susceptible to this relationship and the ballet world, which you know all about and I know very little about. So could you please talk about how does this book address Me Too issues in ballet in the 1950s? And then I hope you'll read a little bit about Katya, read a section of the book that's about her, so our listeners can get a sense of her.
Thank you.
A bunch of things to respond to.
So Katya loses her mother in a truck accident very early. So she's raised by her father, who is definitely able to provide for her needs, but I would say it's not an emotionally warm household. And she has I'm going to use the 1950s term, maiden aunt, who also takes an interest in her and helps get her ballet lessons, essentially to try to give Katya's life some structure in the wake of her mother's death. Katya, as Sharon mentioned, she is an example of Me Too in the 1950s, and I've been talking about this a lot. I think that the kind of relationship where these very clear power imbalances between like conductors and musicians, bosses and their underlings, choreographers and their dancers. This was not an unusual sexual relationship. It was, I think, still not an unusual one today. I think the difference is that it was not only condoned, it was sort of sanctioned. I mean, there were couples for whom this was, a well-known open secret, basically. Katya has another problem, in addition to the fact that her feelings for Boris Yannikov are complicated. He has also made her who she is, and he's given her the possibility of dancing, which is all she ever wanted. So she has a lot of gratitude about that. But Katya has another aspect to her personality, which she's really interested in making dances. Boris Yannikov is a choreographer, and Katya spends a lot of time co-creating with him. And one of her big frustrations is he doesn't ever give her credit for her work. Again, this is something that many, many, many women experience today. I think it was more endemic earlier. There are famous composers who possibly had women even writing their music. Felix Mendelssohn, for example, is reputed to have his sister wrote much of his music. Einstein is rumored to have also I think it was his wife helping out. Anyway, we all know that women are very unsung. So Katya has great appreciation and interest in Boris Yannikov's creative powers, but she wants to be given credit for her role as a co-creator. So I'm going to be doing two different readings tonight, and they're both the same scene, but they're from different perspectives. So the first one's going to be from Katya's perspective. The book opens with John, the Holocaust survivor, in Paris for a medical conference, a psychiatric conference. He's there as a professional, and his boss's wife gives him a ticket to the ballet, which he feels he has to go to, even though he doesn't want to because he doesn't like being around music. But he sees Katya and he's absolutely smitten with her. So first, I'm going to read the perspective of Katya, what she feels like. She has a sensation that somebody important is in the audience, but she doesn't know. This is her debut in Paris. And the ballet that they are dancing is the ballet called Three Muses. Lars, playing the old faun, stood with Katya, readying their entrance. Adjusting his horns, he whispered ballet's favorite good luck term, Merde, Muse of Discipline. Thanks, Lars. You too. Mr. Yannikov paced the opposite wing, scowling. Head down, he gave the impression that his company had just suffered appalling notices, and not that they were instead poised for opening night before the cream of Paris. Katya felt it imperative to gather her forces and ignore him. She fingered her tutu netting and shook out first her right leg and then her left. Three muses in Paris. Katya was relieved for the vast physical expanse separating her from her choreographer. And the expanse between her and Mama? Mama had never even seen Katya dance. Her absence was enveloping. A reminder that despite being embedded in the company and despite Mr. Yanikov, who had willed Katya the stage, conferred on her this feast, Katya danced through life alone. Her memories had grown hazy with time, a few. Mama's toothy grin when she handed her daughter her school lunchbox. Mama's throaty laugh, her butterscotch house dress with the white rickrack. For years, Katya kept up an ongoing monologue addressed heavenward, as if her soliloquies could coat the void that was Mama. Places, the stage manager called. Katya made a last adjustment to the ribbon on her right point shoe and felt the house, feverish with anticipation. Act 1 began. Katya leapt on stage, parting the dancers as if her luminous heat would grill them alive. To dance was to live, to till motion, to impart the joy that welled up every time she took to the stage, her body the vehicle for her art. The lights were blinding. As the music intensified, she skimmed the energy from the audience to breach another dimension. Transcending reason, she danced through raw emotion and spun toward a new center. She had an eerie sense that someone out there had understood her, that she had spoken directly and been heard, that her endless labors had been worth it, the blisters, the pain, the exhaustion, the interminable practice, to dance the muse of discipline, to feel what she felt.
Your command of well, both knowledge and detail. Detail to me is what gives writing its strength. And wow, just listen to the detail in that piece that Martha just read, and it's all through the book too. It's just vibrant. I just, maybe this isn't the right time for this question, but how do you know so much about ballet, and how do you know so much about the Holocaust? How do you know so much about all these things that you're writing about? That because your command of detail and knowledge is fabulous.
Well, first of all, that's really generous of you. I wanted to underscore something that you just said, Sharon, and I'm sure it's true in poetry as much as it is in a novel. It's just a really important writing tip for the writers who are on this call. Detail and specificity is what makes a character come alive.
Yes.
There are a lot of characters who have lived through the Holocaust in fiction, but what makes it this character? What makes it this ballerina? So one of the reasons, so I studied ballet as a child, and I studied at a ballet school that was professional, and I really had no talent. And because it was a professional school, they made that really clear definitely by age 12, and possibly younger. However, they ran it. It was a proving ground for people who would go into the company. This was in Philadelphia. It was called the Pennsylvania Ballet and is now called the Philadelphia Ballet. It's just indelible. It was indelibly imprinted on me. A ballet, the bar work, the first 45 minutes of any ballet class are at the bar. It's the warm up, and there is a pattern that is used worldwide. And those exercises really stayed with me. You know, you how you warm your body up and in what order you do it. The last part of a ballet class is in the center where you don't have the security of holding on to anything, where you practice balance and jumping. That's a little oversimplified, but that's what it is. But one of the things, so I'm going to talk about ballet first. I also had this incredible experience of watching the professional company rehearse, and I just never got over that. I was completely fascinated by that. They would be sweaty and in the worst raggedy clothes, and the choreographer would just like move them around like pieces of furniture. But it was so thrilling. I still can't explain what was so thrilling about it, but it was for me. And I received a lot of early questions on my manuscript. Why does Katya love ballet so much? And honestly, I'm pretty frustrated by that question. And I felt like, why do you love anything? You know, why do you love autumn leaves? Why do you love the person that you love? Whatever. And I thought that the only way to transmit her love of ballet was walking her through the class and just showing what she felt as her muscles were warming up, and her connection with the music, which is in many ballet classes is still live music. There's still often a pianist who plays live, and how it made her feel and what she felt in the context of the classroom, as opposed to, she's a school student, as opposed to her school cafeteria. So that's partially the answer about the my exposure to ballet. I think I'm happy to talk about I'm sorry. You also asked about research. I did some research. Um, I read a lot of ballet novels. I'm reading more technical work now. I wanted to be really careful about not reading too much, and I think
Mhm.
a lot of novelists will tell you that they don't want to be overly influenced by um, reading stuff. But I did read a bunch of ballet novels along the way, and so I'm happy to answer your question about the Holocaust as well. But I don't know. Do you want to stick with this, or should I go ahead and talk a little about the Holocaust?
Um, yeah, if you feel like, because that's going to be the
Okay.
next section, so you might as well head up,
Okay.
my questions about John with the Holocaust. But you knew so much about it. It's so visceral, and I have to say, it's amazing that the Ken Burns documentary was on this week. I mean, what an incredible confluence with your novel.
I know it's really a coincidence. And for those of you who haven't,
Did you plan it?
no, 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 no. I think he was planning it before I was. Ken Burns had a 3-day, 3 episodes about America during the Holocaust, which I think will be very shattering for many people who don't realize America's complicity
Oh
and
boy, it was for me.
unwillingness
Yeah.
to do anything. So I guess what I want to say is, I grew up in a very, very secular Jewish family, but I don't have a memory when I didn't know about the Holocaust. I think was something that was in the water supply. My parents weren't incredibly chatty about it. My dad was a World War II vet, and we did certainly hear about World War II, but we always knew about the Holocaust. Part of that is because my mother lost part of her family in Auschwitz, and she had a cousin who came over in 1937 bringing their joint grandmother, but nobody else, they couldn't get anybody else in the family out. So I always knew that story. It took me till I was a lot older to understand the implications of that story. I mean, if we think of one member of a family, losing one member of a family, having a murder in a family, it destroys the family forever. I mean, but there are people like my cousin, she lost all of her family of origin. And of course, there were people who lost giant extended families. Survival was the exception. So I definitely have been reading about the Holocaust since I was old enough to read. But I also knew other survivors. I had friends whose parents were survivors. I also had other relatives who were survivors who come to Thanksgiving with tattoos on their wrists. It's just something that I always knew about. And I think what happened with me as I got older, two revelations. One is I realized how close it was to my own life. It was this incredibly recent history. And I began to think about the numbers. We can't really, I don't think our brains can process those numbers. They're too gigantic. I mean, to think that an entire, all of Polish Jewry, all of Czech, all of Eastern European, thousands of people being gunned down in open pits in Russia and Ukraine. And that's before the gas chamber started, all of Hungarian Jewry. I mean, it's really massive, and it's 6 million different Holocausts, really. And so going back to the earlier comment that Sharon and I were talking about, I think the best way to tell the story is through one person's experience.
Mhm.
And
For
I think
sure.
a lot of people who write books and write poetry will tell you that. So an early editor or an early reader of this manuscript, when Yanko, who becomes John, when he first comes to the commandant's house, there's a cook there who gives him fried potato peels, not potatoes, because there's not enough food to give him potatoes. And I remember one of my teachers saying, I've read a lot of Holocaust memoirs, but I've never read about somebody eating potato peels. And I mean, I think that's the kind of specificity that you try as a writer to get in
Yeah.
there. And yeah, also, I will say, I'm very, very aware that this story needs to be told forward because we live in a world where there are genocides still happening, and it shouldn't be. It's something we have to recognize, and we have to recognize the risks of bigotry. It's just incredibly dangerous. Bigotry is incredibly dangerous.
Oh, that was going to be one of my later questions, but let's go to John. Uh, as you know, I had a long career as a psychotherapist, and I truly get the power of trauma to infuse every aspect of a person's life. And um, hard as it is and how hard it is to heal from it, if in fact a person ever can heal from it, which I'm not so sure they can possibly learn to carry it differently, but it's so deep for so many people that it just follows them everywhere. John is a true wounded healer. We talked about that at one point. And I was really glad that you gave him a training psychiatrist, because as I know, from my many years of practice and knowing colleagues in the field, you cannot treat people effectively if you haven't dealt with your own wounds. So that's what he's doing there. And I thought it was really, really good that you did that. Masterful, actually. And also your knowledge of psychiatry was pretty impressive too. You might comment on that. But anyway, super important for wounds to heal before one can begin practicing. He was already practicing, but he was under the supervision of this training psychiatrist. So what role does memory play in John's life? And yeah, and do tell us something about John, and what does his training psychiatrist do to try to treat him?
I love that question. And then I think if it works for you, Sharon, I'll talk a little bit about this and then go into reading.
Yes.
Okay.
And
so
then read.
John, I love what Sharon said, and Sharon's poetry is so deep and profound and intelligent about trauma. I mean, I have said this in other venues often, but I think Americans have basically a terrible way of dealing with trauma in general, or at least the public conversation. You can have 30 kids murdered, and the newspaper will say, bring in we brought in grief counselors for 2 days. I'm like, it's just not going to cut it. You don't get over a trauma of the magnitude that John experienced. I guess I agree with you, Sharon. I don't think there's closure, but I also agree that you have to address it. And John is also a character who lands incredibly well in America. He's adopted by this loving couple who give him an education. Their only son was killed in the Battle of Sicily during World War II. They give him everything he has. So he lands beautifully. He has a beautiful career, but that doesn't solve the problem. And so that's where memory comes in. I feel that trauma is deeply connected to memory. I feel on sort of a meta level, a couple of meta levels, the Jewish people have survived because of our collective memory. We don't build cathedrals. We don't really have, in general, we're not like conquerors. We don't believe in conversion in general. I mean, we're not proselytizers. And so the collective memory of the Jewish people is really what's held us together for 4,000 years, and how it's passed along. So that's one aspect of memory. I think another aspect of memory is, I think it's a wellspring for writers, and not like specifically, oh, this is what I did when I was 7 years old, but I think emotional memory it is an incredibly powerful tool for writers. And most writers that I know have really good memories. They have a lot of access to their growing up in their childhood years. But even if you don't have a lot of access, everybody needs their memory and everybody uses it in an important way. So in my book, memory is the most powerful of the muses, and basically for the reasons that I've said. So the portion that I'm going to read now is the same scene with Katya. John is just arriving at the Paris Opera, which is the opera house where he's going to see the ballet. And we're seeing him watch the first scene that Katya was getting ready for and then going on stage for that we just heard. John settled into a bench at the edge of the plaza. Dusk was gray-pink, backlighting the opera. Ballet were arriving, tuxedoed men with stylish women on their arms. It wasn't just the evening gowns or the way women draped their shawls. Their pacing and carriage were glamorous too, each with a distinctive walk, together a pageant. If he weren't answerable to Dr. Leventhal, John would have disposed of Mrs. Leventhal's tickets. He'd much rather spend the evening outside. Inevitably, he went inside. He picked up a program and made his way to the first balcony. The orchestra warmed up as a chorus took their places in the side boxes. The music began, slow, plangent tones paced to the speed of a man's forward tread. The chorus entered deep and serious and sad, as if their voices had taken the measure of John's memory. The curtain lifted on a snow-covered mountain against an aqua sea, a scene to conjure myth. Dancers in blue and green leapt in unison, legs like arrows, arms overhead. They fell into lines fracturing like kaleidoscope patterns or forms in opposing mirrors. Overcome by jet lag, John dozed off. He was in his family's Mainz living room, Mutti darning socks, Papa with his pipe, left thumb over the bowl, right poised to cock his silver lighter. Lopsided smoke rings meandered toward the ceiling. A few more puffs before the pipe hung limply from Papa's mouth as he grew increasingly absorbed in the evening paper. Rubbing his eyes, John slowly woke up. He knew the music. After dinner, when Yanko's schoolwork was finished and he was getting drowsy, Papa had played it on the gramophone. If Yanko was lucky, he'd be permitted a few minutes to sit with the grown-ups before Mutti declared bedtime. The chorus sang with veneration, permeating the hall. The way the smell of Mutti's bubbling apple strudel filled her kitchen, or the first peaty draughts of Papa's pipe suffused the living room. John was flooded with grief, the music a piercing shorthand for all that was gone. All of them. Mutti, Papa, even little Max, who hadn't been born until later. John had not thought about this music in decades, if ever. He recalled Papa starting the gramophone as Mutti settled into the horsehair chair with her sewing kit. Yanko was growing so fast, Mutti had to let out the hems of his trousers. The sewing kit was black walnut, the varnish on the edges smoothed from use. It was from Yanko's grandmother. The orchestra moved with gravity and purpose, music as familiar as childhood. Now it was named Mozart's Requiem. Not only the people and the place, but this too had been stolen. John didn't need to stay. Dr. and Mrs. Leventhal would understand. Searching for the quickest exit, John struggled to call up something, anything to stanch his anguish. What value were his sessions with his training psychiatrist? Dr. Roth was useless. None of the patrons around John budged. He would be imprisoned here until the end of the act. Making another effort, he took a deep breath to marshal his defenses. And then, a lone ballerina sheathed in white floated toward center stage. The audience greeted her with shouts of brava. She was the muse of discipline. She cut through the whirling dancers with precision and exactitude. John had never seen anyone so exquisite. She was a reverie, an evocation of grace. Each flattering arm motion dissipated his pain. Her dancing ordered the music, rendered it alluring. He strained left as she exited, as if by craning his neck he could follow her. She spun in duo with the muse of song, summoning peace and beauty. Together the two made harmony. Their playfulness lightened John's mood. He glowed like a man feeling desire for the first time.
Aren't you just right there with them? not only is she masterful with her excuse me, details and specificity, but her language, her command of language, her vocabulary, it's pretty amazing, pretty impressive, Martha, really.
That's very
Um, so I know we've got time constraints, and I've got like 20 more questions, but let's move on to a good question for next is, how did you get this choreography on the page? I mean, how did you do it? It's so stunning achievement.
Thank you.
I mean, I don't know anything about choreography, but except for having watched dance, but
Well, thank you. And I wanted readers not to have to know too much about dance to be able to read this book. But actually, I think a lot of people know I started this book in 2010, and I went through about a zillion drafts. And for a long period of time, years, 3 or 4 years, I was using I was using ballets that were well known. So I had really centered the book around Swan Lake, which, I'm sorry, it's cliche, but it's probably my favorite ballet, and we all love Swan Lake. It has a very tragic ending, and the music is amazing, all that stuff. I mean, nowadays we can watch whatever we want on YouTube. I must have watched that ballet a zillion times and taken notes. I began to really kind of get anxious. I thought, if anybody reads this book and they know anything about ballet, I'm going to be making mistakes. Like, I don't really know this ballet. I never danced it, all that stuff. And so somewhere along the way, in writer land, you fiction writers, I just jettisoned everything. I had, there's a hospital called Beaumont Hospital. It used to be called Bellevue, which is a real hospital. I went down the rabbit hole with, like, what color tile floors were they in the 1950s? And then I'm like, this is too constraining. So I had to rename everything and go into fiction land. And so I realized that if I made up my own ballets, I would do better. And then for whatever reason, I mean, I read a lot, and maybe I just had an instinct about this. I realized I don't actually have to choreograph a whole ballet. I have to find a suitable name that will thread with the plot. And I need to give the reader a sense of the feeling. What do they feel when the curtain opens? I selected music. Not always, but usually I selected music to go with it. I thought a lot about the costumes. I thought about a lot what the viewer, the audience is going to see. And I realized, if you give the opening scene with a lot of flavors, I think readers have a lot of imaginative power, and that readers would sort of fill in the rest. So in fact, I didn't choreograph ballets. I choreographed short pieces of the opening scenes to let readers fill in. And I think that's part of my 10,000 hours of training, that you can actually put too much on the page as a novelist. And readers come with their own imaginations, and sometimes it's better to let them imagine the rest of it.
Oh, that's so great, because it's really important. I think, I don't know if, I mean, a lot of writers, I don't know if they do this. In fact, I'm sure they don't, because of all the stuff I've read, but you have to write with the reader in mind.
Yes.
If you load the reader up with too much stuff, they are going to they're going to close the book.
I mean,
you want to invite the reader into the book and allow them to have some participation in this process with you. And I think that's another art of a good novelist, which you definitely have.
Well, I really, really agree with you. And I'm somebody who thinks it's 50% writer and 50% reader. And that's, of course, the frustration of not getting published, is you feel like you're missing half the equation. Without the reader, have you written anything? It's the whole in the forest. But the other thing is, readers, it's really important that readers read because they want to imagine other worlds, and they want to be a different place or learn something. So I completely agree. It's really important to let readers have their own imaginative experience. And again, that was a lot of trial and error, a lot of ditching the backstory and leaving it on the cutting room floor.
Why don't you talk a little bit? I know I think we just got a little note that we don't have too much time left to, why don't you talk a little bit about how, you know, how you came to create this? How did you move from being a book critic to writing a novel? And how did you come to you talk about inspiration and hard work, and talk a little bit about how the two things go together. What is that? Who is that person that says it takes 10?
Oh, it's my teacher, my viola teacher said, you know, it's 90% you and 10% teacher. You know, it's
Right,
practice
10%.
for the, you know, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
So I was actually, in my imagination, a novelist before I was a book critic. I started seriously writing novels in the early aughts, and I couldn't get anything published. I mean, I wrote a book and got an agent, and the agent couldn't sell it. Then I wrote another book and got another agent, and the agent couldn't sell it. And this kept happening. So I was, as Sharon knows, she saw me in this state. I was in despair. I mean, it's normal, but you know, everything I was doing was getting rejected. So I ended up getting into book reviewing because I read a lot. And I was like, well, wow, I'd love to share what I'm reading. And it so happened that there was a publication starting up in Washington where I live called the Washington Independent Review of Books. I went to the organizing meeting, and that's gave me my start in book reviewing. And it was kind of life-saving in a lot of different ways. One thing, it made me feel like I was making a contribution because I love sharing what books I read. And it gave me a byline, and I'm not proud, but I was so happy to be getting published. I mean, it kept me sane for all the fiction rejections that I was getting. So I guess in the order of my quote novels that are in the drawer, Three Muses is probably my fifth novel. But so by the time I started with Three Muses, I actually had some tools, some tools in my tool chest. I had to learn a lot more, but the reviewing definitely helped with my sanity. There's just no question about it. And I just really love sharing books with people, especially ones that readers might not have heard of.
And how can people access your newsletter where you do
Thank
all this reviewing? Maybe.
Thank you. So I have a website that's my name, Martha Ann Toll.
Oh, okay.
And I also have an account. My newsletter comes out from Substack. I'd be absolutely thrilled if you signed up. I think it's also called Martha Ann Toll's newsletter. Um, and I am saying this to folks. I'm so interested in talking about my book with anybody who wants to talk about it. Anybody who wants me to come to their book group, Zoom into their book group, I would be absolutely thrilled. Come to your synagogue to talk about it. I would be thrilled. So yeah, thank you, Sharon, for I put out a newsletter every 2 weeks, and I sort of chat about what I'm reading and what's going on in my little corner of the world.
And it's great, and I love it. I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Do you have any advice for writers starting out?
Thank you. Well, I have a couple of pieces of advice. One is the biggest piece of advice is that rejection is what's normal,
Yep,
and
I
acceptance.
second that.
Cute. And Sharon and I have definitely held hands a lot and tried to help each other out. It doesn't get better. The rejections don't really get better, but it helped me a lot to realize that that was actually the norm, and acceptances were extremely rare. So one thing is persist, and the other is trust your readers. I think that any writer who's listening to this will have had the experience of being taken apart by a cruel or thoughtless um, you know, reader. Like, I'm not talking about members of the public. I'm talking about you give your manuscript to somebody. I had an absolutely horrendous experience very early on. It was a friend of a friend, and this person read an early novel. She wrote me a 3-page single-spaced letter, literally tearing it to shreds. She said, "Well, I guess I can live with the title, but I can't live with anything else." And I'm like, okay, that's not a good first reader.
Wow.
So, and that took me a long time to, who do I trust to read my stuff? I'm now working a lot with a very close friend of mine who's a violinist. I love her ear. She's a beautiful ear for language because she has a beautiful musical ear. I definitely suggest getting your stuff read by people in other artistic disciplines, but you should
Mm.
trust the person. And I learned the hard way, which probably a lot of us learn the hard way. I
Yeah.
don't think it's that unusual.
Yeah.
So those are my two pieces of advice.
That's the best way to learn, really. I
Yes.
mean,
Yes.
isn't it? I
Yeah,
mean,
that's what I was going to say. Just what I was going to say is don't wait for inspiration. Get your tush in the chair and write. It's because
that's right.
inspiration is it doesn't really come that way. You just it's mostly work.
Yeah. And you throw out so much of what you write and
Yeah,
start
exactly.
over. And then when
Yeah.
you get to the end, and then when you get your book accepted, and then they tell you you have to cut 30,000 words.
Exactly. Yeah.
Lots of fun. But it is revision. It is revision means re-seeing, doesn't it? I mean,
I love that. Nobody's pointed that out to me. I love that, Sharon. Yeah, I feel like the revision process is everything. I love revision.
yeah.
I'm struggling to finish a draft of a novel right now, and I find getting it on the page initially is the hardest. I love to revise. That's a great. Wow, I hope I'm gonna steal that. I love that. Revision is like really revisioning.
Yes, re-seeing,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what it means, really. And it's another, I came to see it as a very wonderful creative process that I had sort of hated, and then I began to love it as I
Yeah.
did it.
And I agree with you. And I was gonna say don't ever send anything out the day you finish something because you're gonna look at
Oh
it
my God,
and
no,
go like, "Ooh, what did I write?"
no.
I did
It's
that
so,
many times.
yeah, it's so interesting to pull something out that you wrote like a month ago or a few months ago and re-see it.
Yes.
And I do that with poems, and I slash out,
Yeah.
sometimes the whole beginning of, I think I have a feeling, where are you, our
Nicole,
fearless,
you want to back on?
here. Are we ready to have questions from,
Hello.
hi.
Yeah. So anybody who wants to, as a reminder, ask these lovely 2 questions. There is a Q&A box right at the bottom. Right now, all of the things that have come in are just compliments for how much they're enjoying the conversation and liking your book, which we love. But I actually have a question for you while we wait to see some other stuff come in. I have a couple questions, actually. I've been taking notes. So you talk a lot about how memory and also like detail played a role in all of this. The collective Jewish experience memory, and then also like how you have to leave some imagination up to the readers, because giving them every single detail turns out will just bog the story down. While you were writing, is there any detail that you would have wanted to include, either from things that you were pulling from that collective consciousness or in your research that didn't end up making the final draft?
Well, a lot of research didn't end up in the final draft. I'm not sure if I wanted it in there or not. I mean, I cut 100 pages at one point, and most of it stayed cut. I had a very complex, long scene between John and Katya on the day of John F. Kennedy's funeral. A lot of the book takes place in 1963, which was the year that Kennedy was assassinated. And that was another thing where I watched like 42, takes of the Kennedy funeral, and where was the casket and where were the family members, and the music had really stayed with me. I mean, I was in first grade when Kennedy was killed, but the music stayed with
I
me.
was there on that street in Washington.
Wow. Okay, so you would know better.
Yeah,
And I
totally.
certainly remember, my parents just total heartbreak over his murder.
Oh,
And my first grade teacher, we had one television in the school, and she came in sobbing, and so there's a lot that I remember. Anyway, but there's nothing about Kennedy's funeral in this book, so it's all is left on the cutting room floor. I mean, I now could tell you a little bit about the funeral, but it's not there. And I also had many scenes with Katya's mother, the interaction between her and her
oh,
mother, and I cut pretty much everything. And then I think like some writers, I'm not an outliner, but some writers would have written up all of that backstory and just used it for information. I took it out because I realized again that the reader could maybe fill it in. I just used a little teeny bit of it sprinkled through the book. But it was definitely bogging the story. It was slowing the story down.
Yes, I think that was a really good decision, Martha. Yeah.
It,
I don't think we needed to hear, we have Aunt Mary and we have the father. I think the mother and her, the way she died and so forth, you hint, you don't hint at it. You do tell us eventually as she discovers.
as Katya discovers, yeah.
Yeah, she discovers it. And I think that was just right. I mean, I don't know what you had going before, but I don't think we needed the mother.
So, and part of that is recognizing if you're writing about a child, Katya was a child and Yonko was a child when all the trauma happened, then you need to be thinking like a child, and a child doesn't
Mhm,
process
mhm.
the same way an adult was. So
Yeah,
I had to do a lot
yeah,
of revisioning around that.
yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. We don't have any other questions coming in, so I'm just going to ask you one more, and then you have a chance to plug anything you want to plug before we wrap up. The other thing you talked about, Martha, that I loved is talking about your experience as a writer and as a reviewer, and being able to connect people with kind of like under the radar books that they might not have been able to find otherwise. So, question for both you, Martha and Sharon. Is there anything that you have read recently that might have flown under the radar of our wonderful attendees that you think they should be reading?
Well, a couple of books that I read that have since become better known, but I would love to shout them out again. One is Cassandra Lane's, I think she pronounces it Cassandra, Cassandra Lane's We Are Bridges, which is this brilliant, brilliant, also a first book, brilliant memoir about her great grandfather, I think, who was lynched and trying to find the family story. His name was actually Bridges, interestingly enough, trying to bridge to his death, and her own memoir about trying to open up that horrific family secret and what could she learn about it. I mean, it's just a beautiful book. It was published by the Feminist Press. Shout out to the Feminist Press. I love what they publish. And then a book that I um, reviewed and interviewed this author over the summer. I'm really gaga over this book. It's called A Union Like Ours, and it's by a gay writer named Scott Bain, and it's about a privileged gay couple. They were a generation apart. One was a visual artist named Russell Cheney, and one was probably the most famous literary critic of the 20th century, F.O. Matheson. And it's an exhaustively researched book, but it also reads beautifully, and it's really, really interesting about they lived like married men and how did they do that in the first half of the 20th century. Those are my two that are on my mind at the moment, but I could come up with a few more probably. Oh, I want to say one more. Sharon and I both read at the same time Catherine Schultz's memoir called Lost and Found, which
Lost and found.
oh my
Yeah,
God, I loved that so much. That's
yeah.
about, she combines the death of her father, she's a New Yorker writer, and then her meeting and ultimately marrying the woman who became her wife. And it's
Oh, fabulous book.
gorgeous,
Yeah,
gorgeous, gorgeous.
fabulous book. I want to give a plug to another Virginia Center for the Creative Arts writer, Alice Elliott Dark, Fellowship Point. Having just turned 80, I was especially, I love this book. And Alice said she wrote it for people like me. It's a long relationship between two women who are 80 in the book, who live on a little point in Maine, that their families have handed down over the years. Anyway, it's a Fellowship Point. And the other book, oh God, this is partly being, how can I have forgotten the title of this Anthony Doerr's new book?
Oh,
Cloud Cuckoo Land.
yeah.
Cloud Cuckoo Land. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I know people have hated it, but I thought it was brilliant. And it takes a little work to get into it, but it's so worth reading.
And I just, for the ballet maniacs on this call, there's a new biography of George Balanchine coming out in November by the New Yorker ballet critic. Her name is Jennifer Homans. I am so blown away by this book. It's 600 pages or something. It's a doorstopper. every single page is written like poetry. It's so phenomenal. Like, I'm a reviewer. I was like, maybe I should just read it a little quicker. I had to read every single word. I mean, I always do anyway, but I just had to like stay with it. The language is totally beautiful, and she's inside Balanchine's head, and I mean, it's extraordinary. But I think that's coming out November 15th.
This is one of the great things about being at a writing residency. I mean, this is what our conversations are. We just talk about books and writing, and it's and art and music is just fantastic.
It's great.
So thanks.
And I
Mark.
really have to plug Sharon's poetry and her memoir.
Seriously.
I really need to do that. So
Thank you, Martha. She's been such a champion and support of mine. It just means the world for us to be, we're all leaning on each other's shoulders, really. I mean, we all take and give from each other, and it's just very, very special to have a creative community to be part of. And this woman I'm so grateful to know her and to be able to turn to her with writing questions and what do you think, Martha? And anyway, she's a great critic, great woman, great person, great writer. I can't say enough good about her. So
thank you. And I loved what Sharon said at the beginning. I was very honored. I want to raise a glass to friendship, because friendship is always the most important thing. And Nicole, it's just been great. I'll raise my teacup. Nicole, you've been just a great moderator, and I really want to also thank Oblong Books and Sharon for making this all possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That is the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much to Martha and Sharon for joining us tonight, as well as all of you wonderful attendees. Don't forget to hit up oblongbooks.com so you can get these wonderful ladies' books. And if you want to share this event with all of your friends, it should be up on YouTube real soon.
Great.
And if you're watching on YouTube, hi. Thank you all so much for coming.
Okay.
Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Martha.
Good night.